Welcome to Just Horror Channel. Let's not waste any time. This story begins in a village in Belgium. Anne, a young painter, decided to visit Old Tree Village in Belgium. The village was a remote, quiet place with beautiful scenery, and wanted to paint a landscape of the village's serene nature. The journey to the village felt long and lonely. As she entered the village's border, the road became rocky, and the tall trees made the atmosphere more eerie, and felt like she was being watched the entire way. A thick fog enveloped the village, limiting visibility. The cold, damp air added to the horror. Old houses with creaky windows looked deserted and creepy. Some villagers stared at Anne with blank, cold expressions, and felt uncomfortable, and looked for a place to stay and found an old, shabby inn. The owner, an old man named Mr. Rory, welcomed her warmly but with a mysterious look in his eyes. Mr. Rory gave her a room upstairs. The room was spacious but felt cold and silent, and saw the dark and frightening forest from her window. As night fell, the atmosphere grew more tense. Strange noises began to be heard from downstairs, like footsteps and faint whispers, and tried to ignore them. At midnight, the noises became clearer and disturbed Anne's sleep. She felt something lurking in the darkness. A loud knock came from the direction of the kitchen. Carefully, Anne went down the stairs and walked towards the kitchen. Her heart was pounding. When she opened the kitchen door, she found nothing but darkness and silence, and returned to her room with a feeling of unease. She felt something was wrong with the inn. As she tried to sleep, she heard footsteps approaching her room. Her door creaked open by itself. She felt the presence of something unseen. Her hair stood on end, and tried to stay calm despite her growing fear. The first night at the inn, Anne felt restless. The sound of howling wind and rustling leaves was clear in her ears. The atmosphere felt more menacing. As she tried to sleep, footsteps began to be heard from downstairs. The sound was dragging like someone walking heavily, and shivered hearing it. Faint whispers began to be heard, barely clear enough to frighten Anne. She tried to calm herself, thinking it was just her imagination. However, the noises became clearer and closer, and decided to go down and check what was happening. Carefully, she descended the creaky wooden stairs. Downstairs, it was very dark, and relied on the small flashlight she brought. Strange shadows moved in the corners of the room, adding to the horror. Suddenly, a loud knock came from the direction of the kitchen. Anne was startled and almost dropped her flashlight. She braved herself to approach the source of the sound carefully. When she opened the kitchen door, she found nothing but pitch-black darkness, and felt the air in the kitchen was colder, as if something unseen was there, and returned to her room with a feeling of unease. On the stairs, she felt something watching her from behind. Once in her room, she locked the door tightly and tried to sleep again. However, the noises did not stop. This time, she heard scratching sounds on her room wall, and became more frightened, her heart pounding fast, and tried to find the source of the sound by pointing her flashlight at the wall. There was nothing, but fresh, strange scratches were visible, as if something was trying to enter through the wall. When she turned off the flashlight, the sound stopped briefly, but suddenly, the footsteps were heard again, closer and heavier, and felt the presence of something outside her door. The door creaked open slowly, and held her breath, hoping it was just her imagination. But the door kept opening wider. Moonlight broke in, revealing a strange shadow on the floor, and did not dare move. The approaching footsteps were clear. Slowly, the shadow moved into her room with trembling hands and took her camera and started recording. She hoped to capture evidence of what she was experiencing. However, the shadow approached quickly, making it even more frightened. Suddenly, a loud knock was heard again, this time from the window. Anne turned and saw a shadowy figure outside the window. Its face was indistinct, but its gaze was terrifying, and screamed and backed away. The figure disappeared instantly, but Anne's fear did not diminish. She felt watched from every corner of the room, and could not sleep that night, staying awake in darkness and fear. In the morning, Anne decided to explore the forest around Old Tree Village. She brought her camera, hoping to find something to serve as evidence of her curiosity. The forest looked dark and frightening. Tall trees loomed, creating strange moving shadows. The sounds of nature seemed like the whispers of lurking ghosts, and tried to stay focused and alert. As she walked deeper into the forest, the atmosphere grew more menacing, and felt the air getting colder and damp. She felt something watching her from behind the trees. Suddenly, in the distance, Anne saw a figure of a woman with long hair and white clothing. The woman stood still, staring directly at Anne. Her gaze was blank and frightening. Anne felt hypnotized, unconsciously stepping closer to the figure. She tried to take a photo, but her hands were shaking. When the camera button was pressed, the woman disappeared instantly. Anne was confused and panicked, trying to find traces of the figure. However, the forest path seemed to change, and felt lost and did not know the way back. The forest she once knew turned into a terrifying labyrinth. Strange noises began to be heard again, this time closer and clearer. Anne heard faint cries and screams. Her heart pounded, fear taking over her. She ran, hoping to find a way out of the forest. However, with every step she took, she felt farther from the village. Thick fog began to envelop the forest, limiting her view even more. Suddenly, Anne stumbled and fell. When she got up, she saw strange footprints on the ground. The footprints looked like they belonged to someone walking barefoot, and carefully followed them. The footprints led to a large tree with protruding roots. Behind the roots, Anne found an old grave covered with moss and dry leaves. Fear and curiosity mixed in her feelings. As she approached the grave, Anne saw a tombstone with barely readable writing. Suddenly, whispers were clearly heard in her ears, as if someone was whispering from inside the grave. Anne shivered, but she tried to stay calm and record everything she saw. She hoped to capture something that could explain the strange events she was experiencing. When she turned around, the woman reappeared behind her. The woman stood still with a more intense gaze, and felt paralyzed, unable to move or scream. The figure slowly approached, making the surrounding air colder and more terrifying, and finally could move and ran as fast as she could away from the place. She did not care where she was going, as long as she was out of the terrifying forest. The sounds of footsteps and whispers continued to follow her. After running without stopping, Anne finally saw the village lights. She exited the forest, panting and trembling with fear. The villagers, who saw her, only stared with blank looks, and knew something was wrong in this village. After leaving the forest, Anne returned to the inn with a trembling body and a mind full of questions. She immediately sought out Mr. Rory for an explanation of what she had seen. Mr. Rory's face turned serious as Anne recounted her experience in the forest. His eyes were full of worrying. He invited Anne to sit and began to tell the dark history of the village. Mr. Rory explained that Old Tree Village was built on the site of a mass grave. Many people had died unnaturally, and their spirits never found peace, and felt her hair stand on end. The villagers often experienced strange and terrifying events. Some people even disappeared without a trace. Mr. Rory said that the spirits sought victims to accompany them in the afterlife. Mr. Rory told a story about a woman named Genevieve who often appeared in the forest. Genevieve was one of the massacre victims from decades ago. She died with deep resentment, and felt cold envelop her body as she listened to the story. All the strange events she experienced began to make sense. She felt more afraid, but also more curious. Mr. Rory gave an old book containing records of mystical events in the village. The book was written by a villager who had died years ago, and opened the book carefully. The book contained drawings and strange writings depicting ghostly figures that often appeared in the village, and was horrified by the detailed drawings, especially the woman who resembled the figure she had seen. Mr. Rory warned Anne to be careful and not to go alone into the forest again. He also suggested that Anne leave the village if she felt unsafe. However, Anne felt there was something she needed to resolve there. That night, the disturbances intensified. Anne's room door creaked open by itself, and she felt something sitting on her bed. When she turned on the light, there was no one there, just the clear imprint of a sitting figure, and tried to record the strange events with her camera. She set up the camera in the corner of the room and left it recording all night. In the morning, she carefully checked the recording, and was shocked to see a black shadow moving in her room. Strange noises were clearly recorded, like whispers and footsteps, and felt more frightened. She decided to contact her friend, Glenn, an experienced paranormal investigator. Glenn agreed to come and help and find out what was really happening in the village, and felt a bit relieved, though fear still clouded her mind. When Glenn arrived, the atmosphere in the village became increasingly eerie. Thick fog enveloped the village once again, and strange noises were heard more frequently. Anne and Glenn knew they had to act quickly to uncover the mystery. Mr. Rory gave them some clues about ancient rituals that might help calm the wandering spirits. Glenn began preparing everything needed to perform the spirit summoning ritual. Anne and Glenn knew they were dealing with powerful supernatural forces. They had to be careful and not make any mistakes. Tension mounted as the night grew darker. They braced themselves for a night full of mystery and fear. That night, the atmosphere at the inn became more frightening. Anne and Glenn set up cameras in several corners of the room to record any strange activity. Weird noises started coming from the downstairs area. Footsteps sounded like they were dragging, and faint whispers were clearly heard. Anne felt like she was being watched from every corner. Glenn tried to calm Anne, even though he felt the tension himself. Suddenly, a loud knocking sound came from the direction of the kitchen, and Anne and Glenn exchanged tense looks. They decided to check out what was happening, despite their hearts being filled with fear. Carefully, they headed to the kitchen. The atmosphere grew more ominous, and the air felt colder. When they opened the kitchen door, they found nothing but darkness and eerie silence. Suddenly, the kitchen door slammed shut, startling Anne and Glenn. They hurried out of the kitchen and back to their room, and felt like something was following them, making her hair stand on end. In the room, they checked the recordings from the cameras. They saw a dark shadow moving in the room, footsteps, and strange whispers. The recordings made them even more terrified. They decided to set up a trap with string and bells on the door, hoping to know if someone entered. That night felt very long and full of tension. At midnight, The bell rang loudly. The room door opened slowly, and cold air rushed in. And Glenn felt a strong presence in the room. They did not dare to move. A dark shadow appeared in the corner of the room, moving closer to them. And felt her breath catch, fear gripping her. Glenn tried to communicate with the shadow, though his voice trembled. The shadow did not respond, only standing still with a terrifying gaze. And Glenn felt the cold air grow stronger. Suddenly, the shadow vanished in an instant. They both felt relieved, still scared. Glenn suggested performing the spirit summoning ritual the next day. They needed to communicate with the spirits to find out what they wanted. The next morning, and Glenn met with Mr. Rory to learn more about the ritual they needed to perform. Mr. Rory gave them some items necessary for the ritual. They chose a spot in the middle of the forest to perform the ritual, wherein had seen a long-haired woman. They hoped to get answers from the wandering spirits in the village. That night, they began the spirit summoning ritual by reading incantations and lighting candles around them. The atmosphere grew more menacing as a strong wind suddenly blew, and thick fog enveloped them. The long-haired woman appeared before them again. Her face was pale, and her eyes were empty. And Glenn felt very frightened, but Glenn tried to stay calm and communicate with the figure. Glenn asked what they wanted. The woman opened her mouth, and the sound that came out sounded like many people talking at once. They wanted to be freed from their suffering and asked, and to help them find peace. And felt horrified but sympathetic. They knew the only way to end the curse was to perform a calming ritual at the mass grave. And Glenn prepared for this dangerous task. That night, with thorough preparations, and Glenn headed to the mass grave hidden in the forest. The cold night air and thick fog made the journey even more frightening, and brought a camera to record their every step. Glenn carried ritual tools, including candles, incense, and an ancient book of spells. They both felt tense and alert. Upon arriving at the cemetery, the atmosphere became more terrifying. Old graves covered in moss and uneven ground created scary shadows. The sound of the rustling wind was like ghostly whispers. Glenn lit the candles and placed them around the graves, and set up the camera on a tripod to record the ritual. They both began reading the ancient incantations carefully. As the incantations were read, the wind grew stronger, and strange noises began to come from all directions. Whispered murmurs and faint cries clearly rang in their ears, making their hair stand on end. Suddenly, the ground around them started to tremble, and saw dark shadows emerging from the graves, moving toward them. The shadows looked like restless spirits. Glenn continued reading the incantations with a trembling voice, and felt scared, but tried to stay focused on the recording. The shadows grew closer, making the air colder and more oppressive. The long-haired woman and had seen earlier appeared in the middle of them. Her pale face and empty eyes filled with intense fear. But she knew she had to continue the ritual. Glenn directed the candles and incense toward the woman, trying to calm her spirit. He asked what they wanted to rest in peace. The woman's voice was unclear, sounding like many people talking at once, but still understandable. The woman revealed that they were all victims of past cruelty, killed brutally, and their spirits never at peace. They asked for the truth to be revealed and for a proper ceremony. And Glenn felt sympathetic and promised to uncover the truth behind the massacre. Glenn finished the ritual by scattering flowers and burning incense at each grave, asking for the spirits to rest in peace. As the ritual ended, the wind stopped blowing, and the atmosphere became calmer. The dark shadows began to disappear one by one, and the strange noises ceased. and Anne Glenn felt relieved despite still being filled with fear. They carefully left the cemetery, promising to learn more about the village's dark history and uncover the hidden truth. But they knew their task was not over. Back at the inn, and checked the footage she had taken. She was shocked to see clearly recorded shadowy figures, strange sounds, and the appearance of the long-haired woman. Mr. Rory listened to their story seriously. He told them that to truly end the curse, they had to hold a large ceremony in the village square, involving all the villagers. This would be a big challenge, but the only way to restore peace. And Anne Glenn agreed to do it, even though the risk they faced was greater. They knew that the next night would determine their fate and that of the cursed village. With mixed feelings of fear and hope, they began preparing for the big ceremony. On the final night, and Anne Glenn prepared the big ceremony in the Old Tree Village Square. The villagers gathered with anxious and hopeful faces. Thick fog covered the village, adding to the eerie impression. Mr. Rory gave instructions to the villagers to bring candles, incense, and flowers as part of the ceremony. And Anne Glenn led the ritual carefully, reading the incantations given by Mr. Rory. The square was decorated with a circle of candles and burning incense. The cold air and gently blowing wind made the atmosphere even tenser, and felt an unseen presence around them. As the incantations were read, the ground began to tremble slightly. The villagers held their candles with trembling hands. Strange whispers came from all directions, making everyone feel scared. Dark shadows began to emerge from the darkness, moving toward the circle of candles. And Anne Glenn tried to stay focused despite the fear gripping them. They knew this was a crucial and thrilling moment. Suddenly, the long-haired woman appeared in the middle of the square. Her pale face and empty gaze frightened the villagers, causing them to back away. And Anne Glenn tried to communicate with the figure. Glenn asked what the spirits wanted. The woman answered with a faint voice. They wanted recognition for their suffering and a calming ritual. Mr. Rory stepped into the circle and began leading a prayer, asking for the lost spirits to be granted peace. The atmosphere grew more tense as the wind blew stronger and the candles flickered, almost going out. Faint crying and screams echoed in the air. The villagers began to cry, feeling the spirits suffering, and felt something touch her shoulder, causing her to shiver in fear. With Glenn's help, and began scattering flowers and burning incense around the woman. They hoped this action would calm the wandering spirits. The woman slowly became more peaceful. As the ritual reached its peak, the dark shadows began to disappear one by one. The strange noises gradually subsided. The woman looked at Anne Glenn with a grateful gaze before finally vanishing into the fog. The atmosphere in the village square became calmer. The fog slowly lifted, and the wind stopped blowing. The villagers felt relieved despite still being filled with sadness and emotion, and Anne Glenn knew they had succeeded. After all the exhausting and frightening events, Anne decided to leave the village immediately, and to honor the spirits, and did not capture the village's natural beauty on her canvas. The journey home felt lighter even though Anne Glenn knew that the world was still full of mysteries and strangeness. Okay, guys, that's the end of this mystery story. I hope it can accompany you to sleep. Thank you, bye.